Good morning, everybody. Welcome to October, and here we go with Module 5. Yeah, I actually did Module 6 before Module 5. I was inspired to get the writing done for the assignment on Module 6 first. But inspiration hit me this morning. I fleshed out the assignment, so we're ready to go. I modified the lecture a little bit. Let's do this thing. And we're going to talk about adjusting across the lifespan. So what I'm attempting to do here is look at some adjustment challenges across the lifespan according to the period. We're going to look at some major theorists, lifespan developmental theorists. I love lifespan development. I got to teach it quite a bit at Columbus State, and I found the class just a really good time. I've never asked to teach it at Ohio State. There's a lot of researchers here who work in that area, far more qualified to teach it than I am. So let's talk about this then, adjusting across the lifespan, and we'll find an assignment embedded in it as well, so you're probably not too surprised. Developmental psychology is really the study of how organisms change over time as a result of biological and environmental influences, right? And the pattern of development is the product of physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional processes. And that's why I always felt okay with teaching lifespan development, because what you usually see is a three-prong approach to each stage. So almost anyone can talk about physical development. Most of us in psychology have a pretty good background in cognitive development, and the socio-emotional, of course, as a social psychologist, I feel pretty good with that. And there's Emily. Emily is now no longer a kitten, but pretty much full-grown cat, at least an adolescent cat. And she's a cutie, all right. Let's talk briefly about the nature-nurture interaction, in that, back in the day, the big debate, the big argument was, what's more important, nature or nurture? And I think we find at this point in time that the question really oversimplifies the world, that it's nature and nurture for the most part. So thinking in the relative contribution of each rather than which one necessarily dominates the discussion. So it gets confusing, because when you look at the role of genetics, genetics serve as predispositions, right? Our knowledge on how this work will be increased tremendously during your lifetime. You'll probably see during your lifetime more knowledge developed around genetics than probably any other period that's come before, certainly, and maybe even that comes after. The zeitgeist will be the study of genetics, and so that will be part of the story, the epoch of your life, right? Continued study will lead to increased understanding of how genetics affects your adjustment challenges and strategies. So that will just continue to unfold. Consider our previous discussions, though, of epigenetics. You had the discussion board on that, and this is a relatively new concept. It was a fascinating idea that allows the environment to affect the expression of genetics in a way that people largely probably didn't expect, right? There's genetic components of stress response, genetic foundations of personality, so all of these are areas to be explored in the future, and how adjustment can take place in the context of that remains to be seen. Let's talk a little bit about lifespan development. Is it continuous or stages? And this is one of the big developmental arguments. Some people suggest that we have a continuous developmental trajectory, and basically we do what we do and we just do more of the same, that we're just enhancing the qualities that we already have. Others take a discontinuity view, and most researchers, I think, most theorists take the discontinuity view. That is the stage view, if you will, a stair-step view. Strangely, both imply that there's really no movement backwards, and I think that's kind of interesting, because yes, we develop, but we also deteriorate. So it's not a story of just increasing skills. At some point we see the loss of skills or some level of deterioration that can be possible. This is an M.C. Escher picture. M.C. Escher is famous for all his kind of illusion works. This one just cracked me up. I don't know what to say about that other than that's pretty weird. So Let's talk about Piaget. And when I took child development at University of California, Irvine with Dr. Levine, Dr. Levine, great researcher, great professor, really well put together class, some really difficult readings. We had to read Child's Conception of the World by Piaget. We read another book called Beyond Modularity, which was kind of a response to Fodor by Annette Karmeloff-Smith. Some really tough readings. I loved her class, and I got to work in a lab with two of her graduate students, Kim Babb and John Rice. So much of my undergraduate research experience came working in those developmental labs. And advice for you guys, it really doesn't matter which labs you work in as much as that you do work in a laboratory if you're looking at going to graduate school in some kind of empirical psychology. So we learned a lot about Piaget, and I developed a profound respect for Piaget. And of course there's many detractors to Piaget, but I think it's a good starting point. And Piaget watches us move through 4 stages of development: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And the periods are pretty straightforward. How does the child, the infant, collect information about their world? And it really is based on what cognitive mechanisms they have available to them at different stages. So Piaget's basic story is that there's distinctly different cognition taking place at each of these stages. And sensory motor, I mean, when you think about it, it's pretty straightforward. How does a child learn? How does an infant learn about their world? Well, they have their sensory system, which is relatively well developed, so they can experience sensation and the process of perception, and they have motor activity. So we see little biological mechanisms called infants, right, toddlers, that in fact, how do they interact with the world? They find stuff and they put it in their mouth for the most part, right? And that's sensory motor. So let me, motor activity, and let me put it in my mouth, and this is how I understand about the world, much to the chagrin of their parents, right? And then they move through the stages, and Piaget is saying that it's qualitatively different cognitive mechanisms that are operating during these periods. So I think the biggest maybe contribution that Piaget made was his discussion, his theories about schemas. And these are cognitive structures, they're mental structures that help us organize the world. So infants and beyond, right, are just continuously encountering stimuli, and they have to make sense of it. They have to categorize stimuli so that they can make generalizations that help them organize both their perception of the world and their behavior within the world. So they do this through this process of creating schemas. And one of the earliest schemas that infants develop, strangely, is like mom and dad, the two caregivers, right? And male and female become a very early person schema for infants. And they make mistakes, right? Because sometimes they over-include that every male that they encounter now becomes daddy, and every female they encounter might become mommy. They learn grandpa, and now any man that they encounter in the store or wherever else that has gray hair or maybe a beard might be called grandpa. So they kind of overextend their categorization. Now, the schemas help us organize our knowledge, and every time that we encounter a new object, right, then we need to place it into a schema. This is something we do automatically, is we categorize individuals so that we can put them in a schema. And the simple way to do this is through assimilation. And Piaget described this, that this is a process that new information comes in and fits into existing schemes. And some people say schemes, other people say schemas. Right. But sometimes we get an object, we encounter an object or a being that doesn't neatly slide into an existing schema. That is, we're not able to assimilate. And assimilate is a relatively simple process, straightforward. Accommodation takes more cognitive effort, right? And this is where we restructure existing schemas so new information can be understood and can be categorized. So we're fluid in our use of schemas in infancy and toddlerhood, and we make continuous adjustments. And you know, an example that I like to demonstrate this with is we take our 3-year-old to the zoo. And 2- and 3-year-olds often go through and 4-year-olds often go through this process called the naming explosion, and they want to know the word for everything. So as they're building vocabulary, children at this age might ask us 40, 50 times a day, what is that? What is that? What is that? And they're rapidly building this vocabulary. But alongside with what is that is what category does it belong, right? So we go to the zoo. 3 years old, we go to the zoo, and the child already has a bird schema because they've encountered birds, so they know that birds have wings and they fly because schemas have rules, right? But we go by the penguin enclosure, and the child then asks, "Mommy, what is that?" And we say, "Well, that's a penguin." And maybe we're not really kind of ready for what comes next. And the child says, "What's a penguin?" And what they want is they want to assimilate the penguin into a category. They want to know which category that it belongs in. And we say, "Well, the penguin is a bird." And the child, well, then expects the penguin to fly because that's a rule for inclusion into the bird schema. And this is one of the adjustment processes at this point, because now we look at the child and we say, "Oh boy, that's a penguin, it's a bird, but it doesn't fly." And the child might say, "Well, birds fly." And you say, "Well, no, not all birds." And the child's going, "Not all birds fly, huh? Now I have to make an adjustment to my schema for flightless birds." Or that would be a sub-schema, but children probably aren't that sophisticated at that point. So now they, in fact, drag the penguin into the newly accommodated schema, the broadened schema, the adjusted schema, if you will, so that it allows a penguin. And as we move about the zoo, you know where I'm going with this, we're going to encounter one of these things, and then the child is going to go, "Oh my God, what is that?" You know, and you say, "Well, that's an ostrich." And they say, "Well, what's an ostrich?" And you say, "That's a bird." And they say, "I want to see that big bird fly." And you say, "Remember, birds don't necessarily have to fly." And they say, "Oh, okay." And you say, "That bird doesn't fly." Well, so we move through, and notice the child is adjusting their cognition to better understand the world around them. Imagine what happens if you encounter this piece, though. This, in fact, now this really, see, and I say, please note that this adjustment, cognitive adjustment, shouldn't end in childhood. Hopefully as adults we're able to adjust our cognitions as well and our use of schemas. We look at this and we go, "Oh, son of a bitch, what is that?" And the scientists look at this and they go, "Oh, I think we'll call this thing a platypus." And what is a platypus? Well, it's got a bill. So is it a bird? Is it related to the duck? But it doesn't have feathers. It has fur, and that's problematic. And then what's even worse is they say, well, it's warm-blooded. It's got fur, so probably a mammal. But damn, they capture it, and all of a sudden it lays an egg, and they go, "Oh my God, mammals give live birth by definition." That's part of the category, and this is in fact laying eggs. What is the deal with this? So even scientists, right, at their ripe old age or their publishing career say, "Look, platypus, duckbill platypus has made us rethink the mammal schema, that mammals can, in fact, at least one lays eggs," right? So they make an accommodation to mammals. Now, they could have put it in the bird schema, I guess, but they didn't want to make those accommodations, so they made the accommodation to the mammal schema to allow for the platypus. And unfortunately, the poor platypus may be nearing extinction. Who knows what's going to happen to the penguins with the high temperatures in the Antarctic. That's another thing to be concerned about. Lifespan adjustments to schemas then. We got lifelong learning going on. At least we hope that we do, right? We consume content, and the idea then is we question what one knows. We challenge one's schemas, right? That one's existing schemas, we engage in critical thinking, and that's kind of where we're at. So one of the best benefits of intelligence really is knowing what one doesn't know, and that, I know it sounds ironic, but boy, I don't know enough to answer that question, or I don't know about this. That becomes critically important. Now, one way to certainly broaden our schemas and increase our mental cognitive flexibility is through travel, and many people. And if we're not able to physically travel, we can also watch videos, television, movies that take us to these other places, that transport us in kind of a pseudo-travel. Right? We can play metacognitive games to increase our cognitive flexibility. One important, I think, question to ask students to ask, but to ask throughout our life is, this is new information, so new information comes at me and I ask, how is this similar to what I already know? That allows me to lock it in, to associate it with my existing knowledge. But at the same time, then we ask that second tricky question is, how is this similar to what I know, but then how does it differ? So we're looking at both similarity and differentiation. And you can see here kind of this cognition, your thinking activities and processes. And we engage in metacognition, that is thinking about thinking. And this allows us to expand our mental repertoire and better interact with the world. So Piaget's contribution of interest in our context of adjustment, schemas, boom, to summarize, right, help us organize information about the world, but also we have self-schemas, and we talked about that in the self-lecture, right? And we find that Piaget is relatively consistent with Erikson in the first couple of stages. Notice that Piaget only goes to adolescence, where Erikson's going to go throughout our life. The final stage that Piaget holds up is the formal operations, and this is our ability then to generate alternative explanations for what we've observed and think critically about which is probably the best explanation, and that's core critical thinking. Our ability to perform cost-benefit analysis and use probabilistic thinking, so we can weigh options as to their potential costs, their potential benefits, right? And we can also then assign probabilities to the likelihood of something occurring or not. Does that sound like an assignment that maybe we did a little earlier in this class? You know, and I'm a real big fan of metacognition and, you know, thinking about thinking and looking at these processes and mastering these processes on our own behalf, right? So we got this wonderful, most miraculous mechanism. To the extent that we understand how it operates, we're free to then use it in a more willful and a more mindful manner. And of course, mindfulness is a core idea. Let's move on with childhood then. Early experiences prepare us for future adjustment challenges, and we will have to continuously adjust, right? How do children acquire language? And let's think about it. It's kind of a step-by-step process. I already talked about the naming explosion, and this is a way that children learn vocabulary. Note that many of the classes we take in college, many of the classes that we take in high school, many of the classes we take in middle school are really vocabulary rich. How many of you are studying anatomy? And I mean, anatomy, most people think is kind of a bitch of a course, because here is a million terms that we have to memorize, right? That we have to learn, that we have to build this vocabulary. We're required to learn grammar so that we communicate with each other in some meaningful way. So we get a little older, right? We build on the grammar, we build on the vocabulary. We're going to learn the social rules of conversation, things like taking turns, right, and asking appropriate questions. We learn to read facial expressions and assess intonation, because sometimes people employ sarcasm, which they say one thing that they don't necessarily mean. So these are all qualities. These are all adjustment challenges for us as we move to become more fluent linguistic beings, right? And then when Piaget is talking about formal operations, there's one other thing that comes with formal operations. We can begin to start thinking in concepts, and that is think in more esoteric terms, conceptual thinking. Note that in concrete operations, which is like your 9-year-old to your 11-year-old, let's say, they don't have the ability to use concepts. They're in concrete, this in the here and now. Consider, though, that some adults never move past concrete operations and are not able to engage in conceptual thinking. And if you want to say, oh, I don't know about that, Mark, I'll give you a solid piece of evidence. At least I think it's a solid piece of evidence. Go into, and it's been probably a while since many of us have gone into a restroom in a fast food restaurant, but go into a restaurant in a fast food restaurant and ask yourself, why do they have to have a checklist on cleaning a restroom? I mean, for most of us, if I told you I want that restroom clean, I want you to go in every hour, check the restroom, and clean it, then, you would walk in, and what does clean mean? Because clean is a conceptual, clean is a concept. Well, that would mean that the sink should be clean, right? That's free of dirt. That means the floor should be clean, which is free of debris and free of dirt, right? And everything picked up, no trash on the floor. Clean means that the trash cans are empty rather than full. So from clean, if we've acquired formal operations from clean, we can apply clean in all these various sub-detailed contexts. Those people who have never achieved formal operations and are left in concrete operations need a checklist. If you say, hey, clean the restroom, that they're not going to be able to apply that to all the sub-elements of the restroom. So they need that checklist. Concretely, do this. Scrub the toilet. Do this, right? And so it helps organize their thought because they're not capable of formal operations. Think about it. Many of you will be you'll be leaders, you'll be supervisors, you'll be managers. You may have some employees who've not achieved formal operations. So you have to be very specific and very detailed about your expectations about what they do. So abstract words, truth, hope, etc., come to us as a result of formal operations and may not be comprehensible really to others. So, language facilitating process, and this is helping your children to adjust, so to speak, either as a teacher or as a parent, right? Or for some of us as aunts and uncles. Read to children, and that's critically important. To read to children, and then once children develop their skill, we've got to kind of shift the burden onto them and read with children, make them do the heavy lifting to an increasing degree. They need to read more and more, right? Discuss emotions, and emotional intelligence foundationally can be developed through this process. Engage in metacognition and metacommunication. So talk about thinking and talk about talking. These are all components that help a child adjust to their future. So hang on for part 2.